Okay. Good evening. We're in our second class on the Tributaries of Eden, trying to see how different commentaries can see in the same verse that we look at and we read a story, and there's different ways of looking at the story, but there's even more depth of what's going on behind the story, and how all of that fits together into one image of what the Torah tells us. So let's begin with one of the more commonly discussed questions within this parsha. So if you take a look at page 56-57 in the Chumash, there we are told that Abraham arrives in Eretz Yisrael, which was at that point Eretz Canaan. And in verse 10, Vayi Rav ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. And so Abraham goes down to Egypt. Now, he realizes that both he and his wife are in grave danger. And so they work out some very complicated system for how she's going to say she's a sister. And exactly how that works is a discussion on its own, which we're going to set aside. But what happens as a result of this is that Abraham becomes a very wealthy man. It says in verse 16, and he treated Abraham well for her sake. And now Abraham had sheep and cattle and donkeys and slaves and maidservants, female donkeys and camels. Abraham was now wealthy. And if you even look at the language, which is why some of the commentaries really struggle with this, if you look at the language, you see that Abraham almost put that into, because we know he was doing it in order to save both their lives. But it even said, he said, say you are my sister, and this is in verse 13, say you are my sister, so that things will be good for me. We can make a killing off this. That's almost the way it sounds like. And then when we reveal that you're really a wife, they'll feel bad, and that almost sounds like what they're trying to do, which requires explanation. Again, it's not the topic that we're discussing tonight. There are plenty of very very solid explanations for what's really going on here. But Abraham becomes very wealthy. Not only wealthy, but if you look at the next page, and verse 2, there it says, V'Avram kaved ma'od ba'mikneh ba'kesev v'bazav. By the time he leaves, he was overweighed. He was burdened with so much livestock, silver and gold. He was just more than he could hold.
I was going to say, it's just interesting too, because at the beginning of this whole paragraph, it's like ki kaved harav ba'aretz. The famine was very heavy. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a nice comparison. The same word kaved is being used. Wow, that's a good one. Write that down in your Chumash. So clearly, Abraham understands that part of the reason why he's in Egypt is to allow him to become the Abraham that he needs to be. And he sees the money that he gets as an opportunity. Obviously, he would have liked to have gotten it in more standard methods, small investments and slowly growing. But he understands that Hashem wants him to have this money, and so he turns it into. If you keep reading, you see that he's traveling. And he goes back to all those places, and he calls out in the name of Hashem. And the Torah tells us later that he established inns and places for people to stay and people to eat. Abraham now understands that he was given this wealth in order to promote his purpose in the world. And yet, we fast forward a few chapters, just 1.5 chapters, And we have in chapter 14, we have the war between Abraham and the four kings. And Abraham comes out of the war with a lot of spoils. All the spoils of the war, all that had been collected by the four kings, and all the people that he had recaptured. And now technically, according to the law of the land, they were now Abraham's subjects to command. And he has it all. You look at page 64, where in verse 16, Abraham brings back all the wealth, and Lot, his brother, his relative, and his wealth, and all the women and the people. And out comes the king of Sodom. And he says in verse 21, the king of Sodom says to Abraham, let's make a deal. Let's make a deal. This is a typical sodomite logic deal. How about you give me the people, and then you take the money? Who are you? Right? It reminds me of the guy who gets a flat tire on the highway, and so obviously there's nothing more annoying than that. So he gets out, pushes the car over to rolls it to the side, and lifts up the car, and cars don't come with the real thing, so he has like this strange thing that he's trying to undo. And as he's working on changing the tire, he notices that another man comes next to him and starts to unscrew the other tire next to him, and throws it onto the back of his truck, and then goes to the next tire. So he says, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? He says, well, you're not stealing all four, are you? Why can't you share some with us? So that's what it sounds like the king of Sodom is doing here. He comes out of nowhere. Abraham just won the war, beat everything, saved the king of Sodom's life. And he shows Abraham and says, I've been thinking I should share with you. I'm a really nice guy. I'm feeling in a really good mood. So why don't you take all the money? And what Abraham should have said to him was, what do you think you're doing? This is my car. And Abraham says to him, I lift up my hands to Hashem, the God, supreme God, maker of heaven and earth, a thread or a shoelace. I don't want a single thing which is yours. So that you will never say, I made Abraham wealthy.
But he doesn't mind the Melech Mitzrayim making him wealthy.
Right.
And here it seems like he earned it.
Here it's his. There, the king of Egypt gave him all this money under pretenses. Right, and Abraham understands. Listen, maybe we didn't want this to happen, but clearly God has a plan and whatever. And he technically, one would argue, he's not as entitled to it. And Abraham no qualms about it. And here, and the king of Sodom makes this statement. And Abraham, he doesn't just reject it; he rejects it with the "I don't want your filthy money." Not even a thread. You know what? There's some the wages for the soldiers. I don't want to take away from them. So whatever deal you want to make with them, that's fine with me. But for me, I don't want anything, because I don't want you to say that you made Abraham wealthy. This is the question which is raised by many of the commentaries. It's almost when you read the parsha straight through, you should be struck by this question, especially by how extreme the two sides are. And it's quite likely that if you've studied parsha, that you've seen one or maybe even a number of answers to this question. So before I get to, if anyone would like to at any point interrupt with an answer you may have heard.
This is another series of questions.
Well, questions are good too.
So there were hundreds of thousands of people, population of 9 cities. If I were him...
Well, it's only the 5, but yeah.
5.
Because the other 4, the soldiers, were killed, we assume.
So I would go for the people and convert them to be Jews.
And so the Gemara says that Abraham was wrong. He should have said, "No, you take the money, I'll take the people."
Right.
So that is a whole separate discussion. Why did Abraham not take these people?
Is there any reason given why he did it?
Well, there's reasons given also by the different commentaries and in the Gemara, but it's the Gemara holds him accountable for it. Says that was a mistake on Abraham's part. He should not have let the people go. He should have he should have said to him, "You can keep the money, and I want the people."
What is he going to do with the people?
Teach
Make
them
slaves, or?
No, teach them the ways of God. These weren't necessarily slaves, they were just people. They would be his subjects more than his slaves. He would be like the king over them, like the chief over them. So he could have...
People of stone. I mean,
Okay.
You're going to change them?
That's some of the answers given for that is exactly that Abraham saw that these people were beyond redemption, and there's a question of, can you really assume that? That's a whole... Because he's the one who prays for them later. The same people that he said, I don't know if I can handle these people, and then he says, well, maybe some of them are righteous, and God says, well, then why didn't you take them? Right, so, but back to our question. So this is an important question, and because it's a question within the story, it is somewhat easier to explain. So I'll share with you three of the answers, and you'll if you have anything to add to it. One answer given is that the king of Egypt gave him some wealth at the beginning, but eventually when he said, here's more and take everything you want and take it, he felt like he owed Abraham money for doing Abraham wrong, or if not to Abraham, but doing something wrong to Sarah. And the Gemara explains, and this is you even read in the parsha, that they didn't ask questions. They didn't say, well, are you married? Are you this? They just took her, and they didn't care. They took her because they were going to take her. And then, because that's what Avram realizes when he gets into Egypt, it's like, you're going to be taken. So now, so they were already wrong for having taken her. And the truth is, they wouldn't have felt bad. If they would have found out that there was a husband, they would have just killed him. But as it turns out, God afflicted Pharaoh with illness, and so now he said, I wouldn't have done it had I known, but everybody knew that he would have done it anyway. So he did do wrong. So it was, and I'm going to use this word on purpose, it was a form of restitution. And everyone is always entitled to restitution. You do no act of piety by rejecting restitution. If somebody did you wrong, if someone caused you damage and they want to pay you back, then that actually, you're supposed to take that. That's appropriate. The king when Avram goes to war against the four kings, there was no wrongdoing done to him. If anything, he was doing a mitzvah of saving lives. So for him to accept the money as payment, which is how it was being portrayed by the king of Sodom, well, Avram, you did such an amazing job. Why don't you take the money? And this is a public discussion, of course. So it would be presented as payment for an act of kindness for a good deed. And therefore, some of the Mefarshim say Abraham rejects it.
He'd lose the mitzvah if he got paid for it, basically.
But he went to help Lot. He didn't go to do this kindness to Stone. He did it because he went to get his nephew back.
Right, but Abraham is still the man of kindness. And when he was doing it, he realized that he was doing a great mitzvah by saving the innocent people from the tyranny of the four kings. So Abraham saw that as something which he wanted on his list of good things that he did. And he felt that by taking the money, especially the way it was being presented, it would be a payment for his act of kindness. It would make all the troubles worth it financially. And he didn't want that to take away from the good deed which he had done. I want to add a level to this, because this is going to be important later in our discussion, is that in the case of restitution, you're actually doing a kindness by accepting the money. Especially in a case where technically Pharaoh was sinned unintentionally, whether he would have done it anyway even had he known, but he didn't know that this was Avram's wife. And so he assumed that she was willing to go along with this and that he was just the brother. So now his guilt, to allow him the opportunity for him to feel like he's giving back or repaying, is actually a kindness to him to accept the money. And therefore, Abraham, who is the Ish HaChesed, the man of kindness, sometimes you have to be so kind that you're willing to take. And so that was the measure for Abraham. Was the taking an act of taking, or in the case of Pharaoh, the taking might have been an act of giving. So that's one difference between these two situations, was that in one case it was a restitution, and the other case, had he taken it, it would have seemed like payment, and therefore he didn't want to accept it. Let's hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it once we get deeper into these same verses. A second answer which is given is that Abraham knew that Hashem had promised him that he would become wealthy. So, therefore, the first time this happened to him, he understood that this was a message from heaven that he was supposed to accept the money so that he could become wealthy. But once he's already wealthy, and he has all the money he needs, now to accept money from another human being would be indulgence. Again, the answer is simply, he already had enough money. If he had enough money, then why should he take more money? He doesn't need it, and therefore he says to the king of Sodom, and there are those who even add into this, well, that's really the third one. The third answer given, and maybe this is the most important for us, is that Pharaoh, as bad as he was, and it's not the same Pharaoh as later in the Torah who was a tyrant. This one had his issues. He felt that if there was a woman that he liked, then that must be that she belongs to him. But in other areas, we don't find him being such a horrible king. So Abraham taking the money from him would not involve any spiritual issues. But with the king of Sodom is so corrupt that he saw every accomplishment that was good for him as a sign of his greatness. I'm sure you've met people like this, but there are people who believe that any success they have is just a further sign of their superiority over others. The king of Sodom denies any divine providence, any divine support. And therefore, if Abraham would allow the king of Sodom to let him have the money, the king of Sodom would then, on some level, go around the world telling everyone, it's not God's divine providence that provided for Abraham, it's my generosity that provided for Abraham. And that might even put an obstacle before Abraham to discuss God. Because when he says, Abraham's famous, what did Abraham do? People used to come and eat in his inn, and then they would say to him, so what's the bill? And he would hand them a bencher. And he would say, my bill is you have to bench. I mean, literally, the Medrash says, he would say, give thanks to God. And they would say, so if they gave thanks to God, then he would tell them, well, it's okay, you gave thanks to God, God will cover your bill. And if they refused, then he handed them their bill and made them pay. That's the famous medrash that tells us how Avram would do it. So that would work very well if Avram would be able to say, thank God. And the person would say, why should I thank God? He would say, well, because God is the one who provided all this food. But if the king of Sodom claims that he provided all the food, and if the king of Sodom wants his plaque on the outside that said, this soup kitchen is sponsored by Sodom, Amora, and company, then that would take away from Avram's ability to influence people.
Why is it that before we were saying that it wasn't in the hands of the king of Sodom to take the money back, or to take the money, or to take the people? Abraham had rightly won these things, or acquired them through the war. So it wasn't in his hands to actually give it to him. It was already Abraham's.
Right? And that just goes to show you that nothing ever changes. Even in a day before Facebook and Twitter and CNN and Fox and ABC and the internet, even in that world, a man could get up and say about someone else's money that person had acquired by winning a war and saving the life of the king of Sodom. You could still have someone and his PR crew who could represent it as a gift that the king of Sodom had given to Abraham and spread throughout the whole world the information that that famous Abraham got his money by the generosity of the king of Sodom. Thousands of years ago, that was still the case. We just found a faster way of doing it.
It took a longer time.
Yes, but that would be the message, and and that's exactly what Avram is saying. Why is Avram insulting him? He could have just said, "No, I don't want the money." He's saying, "Listen, if you are willing to agree that the money is actually mine, then I'm taking it. But if you think that you're giving me the money, then that's my problem. I can't take money. I'm not going to have you represent yourself as my patron."
It wouldn't work to say that. You're talking about the king of Sodom. Even if you were to agree, there's no way to know that he's going to keep his word.
He's not telling him if. He's saying, I can't take the money because the way you're talking to me already tells me that you believe that that you're entitled to it. If that's the case, then everyone's just going to say that the king of Sodom is providing, and so therefore you keep the money. So he was almost giving him musar at the same time that he was rejecting the money.
He just says, far be it from me to take anything that's not mine.
No, he says,
So
I won't take
this is yours and I don't want to take it from you.
No, but
so he's not really giving, where's the musar?
He's saying, and he finishes, so that you shall not say, I made Abraham wealthy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Right? So he's saying to her, listen, it's my money. We both know it's my money. But from the way you're talking, I don't want something that's of yours. So, and that's why he raises his hand as an oath and uses this extreme, a thread or a shoelace, because I don't want any of your input. I don't want any of your influence. That's, there are many times there are people who will make a donation to a cause and they'll say, I'll give you money if you, change the facade of the building or if you do the following. And that's sometimes organizations will accept it. But if it would be right, you would say, well, either you give but for you to give and then tell us and use it, especially if you're coming in the first place, sometimes people will give and then say, approach later and just assume that you understand that since they gave, that they're now entitled to say. But this is a lot worse, where you actually show up in the first place and are already saying, I'll give this much if you, that's a slippery slope.
How do we know that he saved the king of Sodom? I thought the king of Sodom just showed up when Abraham was coming with all the people.
It says, I found the exact verse. It says in verse 10, 14:10, there it says that the king of Sodom fled and they fell into these tar pits. and so they were going to die. They were actually in real danger. And then Avraham comes by and he chases away all the soldiers and brings back all the people.
Because it says in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Vayetze Melech Sodom Likrato. So it
Right,
sounds
because
like-
he had been able to escape because the armies had been taken away. They fell into these tar pits, both the kings.
The king fell into the tar?
Yeah,
So
that's-
why does it say that which kings? The kings that were opposed to Sodom, or the kings?
No,
that were
it
with-
actually says in verse 10 that the
Yeah.
king of Sodom and Amorah fled and they fell into these tar pits.
So who saved them?
So I mean, the Torah then switches in the narrative and goes to Avram. Avram shows up and he brings his army and chases all the enemies away, allowing the king of Sodom to escape. According to the Medrash, Avram actually pulls him out. But even without that, just the reading of the verse, he was trapped, and basically, unless someone chases away the enemy, he had no way of escaping. So he could have come out by a branch or, treaded tar. I don't know exactly how you get out of that. But somehow he managed to survive only because Abraham chased away the enemy.
It's just funny that it says that Melech Sodom went out to greet him. It sounds like he came from another direction.
Well, because Abraham chased the enemy way beyond that space. And so Abraham's return, the king of Sodom, I hope he had a bath before he came, but he might have still been, still had a tar mark on his...
Is there any sense in which, I'm not trying to defend the king of Sodom, but the circumstances under which Lot came there, it seems like we already had a situation where Avram was saying, you're taking stuff that doesn't belong to you, or the shepherds that were telling Lot that. And so in the sense, we have this whole idea of sodomite behavior,
Right.
where maybe in some sense, because he's from Avram's family, maybe the king of Sodom is saying to him that, you have sort of a liability here. You sent this guy over to me. We let him come and all of that sort of stuff. So therefore, it's a quid pro quo. So now that after this battle is over, because I was willing to let him come,
Well, you're going to have a hard time reading that into the verse, because he's giving him the money, not the other way. He's telling Avram, you take the money. So you take the money because we let Lot come. It's hard to read that into the argument of the king of Sodom.
okay.
Right? Unless you say that he was telling him, even though you let Lot come, we're still going to let you take the money, but then you still have the problem for why didn't Avram take it. Right, but okay, you could probably present a number of arguments, all directed into the Avraham needing to represent himself within the logic of Sodom. However, I'd like to offer another explanation for the difference between these two cases, but this requires a much deeper understanding of what's really going on here on a whole deeper level. And the introduction to this is maybe something which we'll come back to, but this is one of the most important statements of the Ramban in Sefer Bereshis in terms of understanding the stories of Sefer Bereshis. So I'm just going to translate loosely. Abraham passed through the land until he came to Shechem, says the Ramban. I want to tell you a rule, which with it you can understand all the upcoming parshios regarding Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This is a very important principle, and the rabbis gave it 6 words. It's one of the most important principles in all of Sefer Bereshis, and our rabbis, as they always do, mention it in very brief, and these are the words of the rabbis. Kol ma she'ira la'avos, siman labanim. Whatever happened to our forefathers is a sign for their descendants, which we have shortened into Maise avos siman labanim. Right? The actions of our forefathers, or the experiences of our forefathers are a sign for the children. Therefore, says the Ramban, the verses seem to describe travels and diggings of wells and other seemingly unimportant events, and the reader might come to think that there's some extra information here with no benefit. But they are not discussing the present. They are all instructing us and informing us for the future. For when something happens, which that would be, to any one of our three forefathers, you must analyze the story and see how that applies to their descendants, meaning yourself. Furthermore,
For us in our day, or
all the future generations. Furthermore, he says, and I don't know if I have time to read all this, but let's read it anyway. You should know that all decrees from above, they are in the stage of decree. They will not necessarily come to being because there are always factors that can cause change. However, once that decree is turned into a preview of an event, then that decree will happen. Meaning, if God has foretold that there was a certain war that the Jews were going to win, so the prophet tells the king, take an arrow and shoot it into the air. And the king takes the arrow and shoots it into the air. And the prophet says to him, there now, that's exactly what's going to happen. Your arrows are going to defeat your enemy. So what a waste of an arrow. We both know you can shoot an arrow. So the Ramban tells us, no, it's that shooting of the arrow which takes prophecy from being potential and brings it into the world through a previewed action of future events. Very important idea. Therefore, Hashem wants Abraham to travel the land. And in different places, God gives him real life previews of future events, and that assures that those events will happen. That's the Ramban.
So going back to the story with Egypt.
Oh, well, we'll get to Egypt soon. Exactly.
Won't take too much of it.
Well, no, let's go to Egypt. Go on. So therefore what?
It's like Pharaoh's house gets plagued with plagues. He gets sent out of the country, and he has a lot of wealth. So it seems like...
And he went down because of a famine.
He goes down to Egypt because of a famine. They are taken into bondage, in this case Sarah representing the Jewish people, and Paro is afflicted by plagues. In fact, if you look at the word that the Torah uses, Vayinaga Hashem as Paro Negaim Gedolim, not only him, Val Beso, and his household. And he says to him, Vayitzav of Paro commands, Vayishalchu Oso V'esishto. He kicked them out. Unlike later in the Torah where you have Avimelech, who says, why don't you pick, we feel very bad, why don't you pick whatever piece of land you want? No, here, Paro sends them out. And they come up with great wealth. So says the Ramban, you read the story like that and you see that same story that we're reading as some isolated individual event for Abraham and his wife is actually, if I could use this word, prelude, and more than a prelude. It is a way to assure. It is a, what's the right word? Right before a wedding, what do they do? A practice session.
Rehearsal.
A rehearsal? Yeah, let's go. It's a rehearsal of the story of Egypt.
the fact that he said that and the rebellion saying that, could it be understood that that preview of what's going to happen might happen more than one time? So that what happened to Avram was a preview of what would happen to Bnei Yisrael, and that might not be the only time.
Absolutely. In fact, what happens to Avram might happen to Yitzchak, and then might happen to Yaakov again, because...
Even in the future to us as a people.
Right.
That's...
Absolutely. So this path opens up a whole new reading to all of Sefer Bereshis. Not just from Avraham. This is where he introduces it, because this is where the Torah starts to tell us all kinds of random events. Avram went here, Avram went there,
You say
right?
that was the most obvious?
Well, this is the first one that should bother you, where it just says Avram traveled to the place, and then he came to Shechem. It almost sounds like we're describing Avram's birthright trip. He went to this, he went there. That's what. Who cares where Avraham visited?
Because it's telling us there's going to be birthright trips.
Right? No, but now we know that when the Jews are first going to arrive, that's exactly what happens when the Jews arrive in Eretz Yisrael. The first place they go is to Shechem, the two mountains, Har Gerizim and Har Eval, and there's a whole new layer. In fact, if we were really good at reading the Parsha, we could have known the results of the election before it happened, because we could have just read it, because it's already all been precluded.
Which part of this parsha would have told us about?
I don't know. Yeah, I say if we knew how to read it properly, if we knew how to read Sefer Bereshis properly, we could find more information, and even towards the end of Parshas Vayechi ends right before Yaakov's death. It says, and Yaakov calls his sons together and says, let me tell you what's going to happen at the end of days. Look at that, right? At the end of Sefer Bereshis, Yaakov is about, and then he loses the information. So it's somewhere concealed within, and we know that within the blessings of Yaakov is the secret for when Mashiach is coming, especially in that line where he says, Ad ki yavo Shiloh, until Shiloh comes. And who is this Shiloh who's going to say... Anyway, so once we know that that's the way to read the Parsha, so listen to this. Vayhi b'mei Amrafel melech Shinar, says the same Ramban, a couple of chapters later. He says that the Torah spent a lot of time describing the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and they were rebelling, and they were this and they were that.
How many years here, how many years there?
Yeah. He says, Hamaisa Zeh, this story, the event of the 4 kings who Avram is going to battle, Ira Avram happens to Avram, Lahoros to teach us, Ki arba malchios tamodna limshol ba'olam, ubesof yizgabru banav aleim. There will be 4 kingdoms that will rise up against the Jewish people, as we'll see soon. Babylon, Greece, Persia, the other way. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those are the 4 kings. And just like Abraham overcame the 4 kings, that was Abraham arranging for us to survive the 4 nations. Eventually, we will overcome them. And we did. We overcame Babylon, we overcame Persia, we overcame Greece, and we're still waiting to overcome Rome.
Well, could this be sort of an indication about World War I or II?
Well, let's take a look and watch this, because there's some information here we certainly can learn. Yeah, if we would know how to read it properly, then we would be able to find all kinds of information. Let's take a look. If you look at page 60, 61, Vayhi, and it was in the days of Amrafel Melech Shinar. What's Shinar? Torah itself tells us that Shinar is Babylon. You can look back earlier in the Torah, and you'll see that Shinar is the same name that the Torah earlier applies to Babylon, and the reason why it's called Shinar is because Shinar means where everything got swept into, because that's where all the dead of the flood got swept into, which is actually why it's called Bavel as well, because Bavel related to the word Mabul. And so, and it was in the days of Amraphel, the king of Babylon. And then Arioch, the king of Elasar. So he says, Elasar, says the Ramban, was the name of a city in Media or in Persia. It was one of the names of the big cities that the Persian Empire was in. It's almost as if the Torah is saying it was in the days of Amraphel, the king of Babylon, and Arioch, the king of Persia, and Kedar LaOmer Melech Elam. He says, we know those people. Those are the Elamites. Anyone who's done a little study of ancient history, this is actually a very confusing area of world history. The world has a very difficult time, just in general, tracking and placing the story of the Persian Empire. Because the Persians didn't feel any need to write. So all the information that we have, basically all the information that we had up until 100 years ago, was either Greek writers such as Herodotus and the like, who were very big Greek promoters, and so they told a very strange story about these wild barbaric Persians, and it's just the whole thing is messed up. But we had no choice; we had to accept it because it was all we had, and the Bible. So those were the only two, and the world never accepted the biblical account of things. So basically it was Herodotus and his followers, his students who wrote other stuff, that they had to describe Persian. So today, since we found all the cuneiform scripts everywhere, and we've figured out how to translate them and everything, so now we have a little bit more information, but it's still a big blank in terms of world history. But we know that one of the previous people before them was the Elamites. And it's interesting because the Talmud discusses the Greeks as emerging from within Elam. Says the Ramban, Kedar LaOmer, the king of Elam, represents Greece. And then you have Sidal. Sidal, the king of what? So the name of the place is Goyim, right? But because that was the name of the place. But we know what Goyim means. It means nations. Because the fourth empire, we're being told right here in the Torah, isn't going to be one single consistent nation. Unlike Babylon, which was just Babylon. Persia is just Persia. Here it starts off as Rome, but Rome is gone. So what does it become? So for the next 1,000 years, they'll call it the Holy Roman Empire. And they'll have the Holy Roman Emperor, who will be the King of Spain or the King of France or whoever the Pope of the time feels is best supporting him. That's who will be the Holy Roman Emperor, because all of Europe or Western civilization considers itself a continuation of the Roman Empire. And really, that would mean then that even the United States would be a continuation of the Roman Empire and what it represents. And I once heard this from someone who told me that the U.S. Capitol, stands today, was built on a place where before the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, was actually Rome. That was the name of it. And I didn't believe this person, and so I researched it and found that that person was right. The capital today stands on a plot of land which was, before it was named the capital, it was a small town called Rome.
Rome,
DC.
DC.
It wasn't DC yet. It wasn't DC. It wasn't the United States even. The name of that place they had named it. Now that's all gone. But they built it on this place called Rome. Check it out. I certainly did.
So there you have your prediction for the campaign. See, right there.
Right. Well, we'll see. Yes.
So
Now, could the term goyim be considered more broadly, that nations as nations more broad than the holy?
Which is exactly why there's a power for us to be under Islamic rule.
That's
And they're not Edomites. They are Ishmaelites. They are Arabs. And that can work as long as, because he's called Sidal Melech Goyim.
So the fact that in Europe now, the Europeans don't have a birth rate that allows them to
Right, so
replace
if in
themselves,
20 years...
and in 20 years, it's going to be majority Muslim in Europe, that doesn't change this Rome thing. It's
Right,
still-
because the Torah doesn't call him by some name which would allow him to identify as it did with all the other ones, Elam being
Right,
Yavan.
yes.
The Torah says Sidal Melech Goyim, as if the Torah is telling us that it will always be a conglomerate of nations all following or extending the Roman exile which begins in the 1st century.
Could extend worldwide, not just potentially? I mean, there's still...
Right, yeah, absolutely.
There's still East Asia.
Right? So he says, the Ramban uses the words, and actually these words of the Ramban that I'm about to read do not appear in any of the old editions of the Ramban, because for the last 800 or so years, less than that, we, as the Jewish people, have been very afraid to print anything anti-Roman which would then be interpreted by them as anti-Christian. So as much as we're trying so hard to say, well, no, Rome represents all of Christendom, they saw it that way. And so they saw any anti-Roman statement as an anti-Christian statement, even though logic would say that the greatest anti-Christian edifice in the history of the world was Rome, which, according to them, actually killed their Savior and then persecuted the Christians for hundreds of years. But then they changed their minds, and now Christianity becomes synonymous with Rome. Says the Ramban, this Sidal Melech Goyim is a king over many nations. This alludes to Rome, which its king is a ruler over a conglomerate of many different nations, the Kittites and the Edomites and many other nations.
What does Sidal represent? Sidal.
That was his name. So we would then, if we would study this well, you'd have to look into his name, or at least look into the books that discuss what the meaning of his name is. And there are such books that break down the meaning of the name, the letters and the numerical value, and all of that should give you more information about this 4th exile that we are. And so now they are in a battle with Abraham. And Abraham overcoming these nations, he says, Ubesof Yizgabru Banav Alehem, represents us overcoming these nations. For Yiplu Kulam Biyadam, and our enemies will fall into our hands, which, as far as we can tell, has not yet really happened. V'yashivu kol shavusam u'rechusham, and we will give them back all their people and their money. We don't come out of Babylon with Babylonian money. We don't come out of Persia with Persian money. In fact, when the Persians sent some money to build a temple, the Talmud tells us that's one of the most horrid forms of generosity ever. The king of Persia sent beautiful wooden beams to put into the Beis Hamikdash, so because the Jews were going to build it of stone, and he wanted some wood in there in case he needs to burn it down again. We don't want their gifts. The Gemara uses that as the example of tzidkas le'umim chatas, that the charity given to us by our enemies is actually sinful. because it was a trick to try to, he said, let's send them wood in case we need to burn it down again. And so we don't take the Edomite money, we don't take the Roman money. Abraham says, because now let's introduce the king of Sodom. The way the world works, this is a world in which we live in, and I'm not identifying who Sodom is in our modern world. You could spend all day debating who would be the Sodomites of our world. But the sentiment that we are the ones who are supporting you, and therefore whatever you're doing needs to work according to the way that we tell you to do it. Abraham is sending a message to the Jewish people that that's a very dangerous way to be.
Could you say that again?
I'll say it again. The nations of the world allowing us to have money and wealth and whatever it is that maybe we are entitled to. Let's call it restitution.
What do you mean by allowing us to have it?
Well, they say, here, we'll give you this funding, we'll give you
They're
the...
giving us the money. Okay.
Right,
As
right.
restitution, not as a gift.
Well, you see, is it being treated...
Germany.
Right, right. So what we're saying is we can take the German thing because it didn't come with any strings. It was restitution. So because it's restitution, according to that first explanation for the difference between Egypt is, if they really feel that we are entitled to it for whatever work we're doing, for all the scientific progress that we're producing, and therefore they want to support us and give us opportunities to help the whole world develop through all the advancements which are occurring, being made by all the Nobel Prize winning Jews in Israel. If that's why they're giving the money, because they feel that it's money that we are owed, that we need to be provided for their benefit. So says Abraham to us, he says, you can take it. On the contrary, that's the means by which Hashem wants you to live. But when you start to take money, and I'm not saying whether this applies now or will apply in the future, once the Jewish people are free, once the Jewish people are independent from any foreign needs. Once we do become, right, we're assuming that that's the coming of Mashiach, that's the point at which someone will come along and bring the Jewish people to a place, bring the whole world to a state of peace. The one who will stop the wars between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, go calculate World War II or World War III, whatever it is, what the 4 kings and the 5 kings are going to be. However you're going to figure that, the one who's going to stop that war and is going to then create this space for the Jewish people to be safe, that person is going to be faced with a world that's going to say, well, we'd like to support this cause. And at that point, I'm not saying whether we've already experienced that point and failed with it, but whenever that point comes, the Torah here in this week's Parsha is telling us how to recognize when we are to take and when we are not to take the money. And it's going to come down to, are they going to recognize, again, the different explanations which we gave, but the last one which we said, that the king of Sodom, if he feels that it's his charity and his kindness, and not that it's God's money, then we are unable to take it. If the nation sees it, that they've been given extraordinary wealth by God in order to spread and give to the rest of the world so that the world can benefit, then we can take that money. These verses are not just speaking to Avram, but they're instructing us. And I want to add one more layer on a more Kabbalistic level, because we've moved from the world of Pshat into the world of Remez and Drush. And
What about sword?
yeah, so just to add a little bit of sod into it. So there's something more here. and I have very little time, so I'll try to say it very quickly. And this is a concept which I think we'll come back to in the later parshias. What we're missing here is the discussion regarding all the holy souls.
There you go. I was jumping.
Yeah, absolutely. The holy souls.
If Abraham had taken some of those people, of whatever the reason, would there now be the potential of more holy souls in the last days being
Well, the number of souls doesn't change.
oh, okay.
But Avram's missed opportunity to capture those souls means that at another opportunity we are going to have to capture those souls.
So, okay.
So the Degel Machne Ephraim, he's the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, says in the name of his grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov, he says that the tzaddik, a real righteous person, has the ability to draw the holy souls and the sparks of holiness, not just by taking people, but even by acquiring and drawing the wealth of a certain person. By that means, you can transfer. This is a very complicated subject which we have to explain at length another time. But you can transfer and collect the souls and the sparks of holiness by accepting that money. That's why Yaakov collects the souls by taking the sheep of Lavan. That's how Abraham takes the holiness within the land by buying and purchasing. That's why we find these purchases that are happening. It's because the taking of the money actually allows the collection of souls, and therefore in this case, Abraham's rejecting of the souls takes with it a rejection of the money, because Abraham felt that these souls were not ready for reabsorption or whatever that process is. Abraham is not just looking at this from a perspective of the practical wealth and sovereignty over these people, but he also needs to calculate his process of absorbing the souls. And Abraham right now is at a place where he's drawing in the souls by teaching them, by direct contact, by direct communication. And this more complicated process of taking money and therefore collecting souls, and then the children born from this family will then, we're not ready for that yet. And the Gemara holds them accountable for it. So while Egypt, which we know is the hotbed of where all the holiness lays, Avraham readies the process for the Jews to collect the 600,000 souls and bring them out of Egypt, Sodom is not quite ready for that fixing. And as Mirza Hashem, we'll talk about it later, it could be that in Egypt, when the Jews go down to Egypt, they find those souls that Avraham didn't pick up. And they do end up collecting them because they found their way into Egypt. But we'll talk about that at a later time. But you see how the surface reading of the verse just barely covers the outer layer. You look deeper and you see the same discussions happening at a much deeper level within the secret reading of the Parsha.
So the wealth connected to these sparks, or the sparks were connected to the wealth that the Israelites took out of Egypt?
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely,
okay.
right.
I'm
And that same burdening where God begs them, please take the money. Otherwise, you're missing the whole point here. Because we couldn't collect all the souls, but we can collect all the money, and with that draw with us the holiness, which can then later be fixed. Through the process of the Mishkan and whatever else we do, we can elevate these sparks of holiness and these souls that we collect. That's all. But please, you got to take the money, and that's part of the secret of what's happening in this parsha.
In the building of the Mishkan, where parts of it were taken from Lebanon and things like that.
By the Beis Hamikdash, yeah, absolutely, and the Beis Hamikdash, because we know the Jews travel all over the world to collect the souls now, which today takes the form of actual people who have these souls. But in the days of the Beis Hamikdash, we didn't need to do that because people from all over the world came on their own. Because the Beis Hamikdash was this big giant magnet for holy souls, and today we don't have that big giant magnet, so we have to actually go out there and find these people, and it's a very difficult process.
So wait, are the holy souls belonging to people? Or are you saying
They can be trapped within people, and then we have to recapture those people. But the tzaddik knows how to interact with the guardian of the soul, the custodian of the soul and be able to take that soul out just with a communication and an interaction like Yaakov does from Lavan. Yeah, we'll discuss this more at length at a later stage.
Is it a Jewish soul or it's non-Jewish?
A holy soul. Holy
Holy
soul.
soul is Jewish?
Part of this original 600,000 souls, yeah.
So it is a Jewish soul.
Well, yeah. Yes.
But it may not
if-
be in a Jewish body, is
Right.
what you're saying.
Right. All right, thank you.